Yes, I did lead the evaluation, but I had a great team with me, with Alex, with Noel, Irene, and other people that collaborated. So I'd like to thank them as well for this effort. Since I think the spotlight should be on our panel, I'll try to keep this presentation fairly short. So I will focus on the key messages that came out of the evaluation. And in particular, I'll present to you the 5 key messages that we had. The first one is that private equity is an increasingly important source of capital in Asia, and ADB can play a role in key market niches. The second message is that financial returns for direct equity investments significantly outperformed private equity funds. Recent portfolio trends point to a shift toward investment at IPO and the targeting of more established large funds. The third message is that the development performance and results of direct equity investments fared much better than private equity funds. And overall, only half of equity investment succeeded developmentally. The fourth key message is that ADB organization for delivery hinders its ability to source, add value, and exit equity investments. And the last key message is that ADB lacks an overall business plan for private equity investments at a time where headroom has been dramatically increased due to the merger of OCR and ADF. Let me elaborate on the key messages. So on my first message, private equity has become increasingly important social capital in the region, with PRC and India attracting the largest share of interest from the investors. On its part, ADB committed 1.8 billion in 67 private sector equity investment between 2006 and 2017, almost equally split, you can see there, from between private equity funds and direct equity investments. At the end of 2017, equity investment made up only 1% of the total outstanding portfolio of ADB and account for 16.2% of non-sovereign outstanding portfolio. Again, majority targeting PRC and India. With respect to my second message on the financial returns and recent portfolio trends, the aggregate IRR of the equity portfolio during the review period was 11%. As you can see there, is highly skewed and positively influenced by the direct equity investment, which returned 16.7%, while PEFs, private equity funds, underperformed at 3.2%. It's worthwhile to also mention that ADB invests in 2 equity vehicles, Asian Infrastructure Fund and CGIF, that are more strategic in nature, so they're not producing significant returns. As part of the evaluation, it was also important to look at the recent trends in the outstanding portfolio, as ADB recently disposed the most successful equity investments, and it's left with only an overall IRR of 4.7%. As you can see from the table there, the return is mostly driven by publicly listed direct equity portfolio, reflecting the increased investment of ADB at IPO. The financial results of PF are still low, given the continued presence of underperforming legacy portfolio, with no visible yet improvement of the changes that came with the strategy of targeting larger established funds. In terms of development, my third message, the development performance of ADB equity investments show the direct equity. You can see the red line up there. Direct equity has have been constantly and widely outperforming private equity funds, which is the gray line. However, on average, the success rate of equity investment is just about 50%. Results on the ground shows that the same pattern, with direct equity generally improving access to finance, expanding operation, and strengthening financial sustainability of the investee companies. In some instances, they were catalytic and had demonstration effect and produced linkages and market and sector development. Funds results, on the other hand, were well below expectations. I now come to my fourth message, which is on the organization for delivery of equity investments. Here, the evaluation notices that there are several organizational pitfalls stemming from the fact that ADB mindset has been originally historically debt-oriented, and therefore equity specialization in ADB is limited and or not organized. This is reflected in several operational aspects, from deal sourcing to value creation and portfolio management, including the management of the exits of the investments. My last message is on the issues. Externally, there are several risks that can impact equity investment, and not always under the control of ADB. Additionally, there's a natural resistance that ADB faces when entering the capital of traditional family-owned businesses. Internally, at ADB, there are several fundamental issues, starting from the fact that ADB equity investment lacks strategic focus. This lack of strategy spreads to several organizational aspects, like staff capacity or equity portfolio management, to business choices like entering direct equity investment at IPO. The report presents two levels of recommendations, strategic and operational. The strategic ones focus on recommending ADB to prepare a detailed equity business plan and to refine the approach to private equity funds. The operational recommendation target the need for reviewing the organization for delivery of the equity business, the need to, for ADB to play a more active role in this equity investment, especially when they get board membership, and then to improve the reporting of the development outcomes.
So we have a very interesting topic today. We're going to be talking about private sector equity investments here at the Asian Development Bank. And we have an esteemed group of expert panelists that are joining us to talk about this topic. And these panelists are going to be talking about this from different angles. So the first round of discussions are going to be on equity as an instrument to promote development effectiveness. So I'm going to start this round with Craig Roberts, PhD. So we know in emerging economies, in developing member countries, there is a big need for equity, the riskiest capital that these companies need. And so there is a big need for equity. So we want to understand, Craig, can you describe the demand that you see in these various regions in Asia Pacific for equity, and how can equity contribute to development effectiveness? How can ADB, through the use of equity, contribute to development effectiveness?
So I think that's, thank you, Nathan. That's a great opening question, because I can only agree with you, which is good for PSOD and IED. As you say, the need is absolutely huge. And if we look at the majority of our DMCs that we cover, their capital markets are relatively underdeveloped compared to where they are on the GDP scale. So they're really a little bit behind, both in terms of bond and equity markets. Now, I agree with one of the things that Enrico said. One of the things as an ADB banker is we do think more about debt than equity, and we do tend to think more about infrastructure than any other sector. With equity, I think you have potentially a very, very powerful instrument that you can deploy, potentially more powerful than debt, right? Because if we think about equity as core capital, and the need for any type of capital is huge in our DMCs. If we think of the nature of equity, at its simplest, it's there to enable somebody to start a business, right? It's there as a form of capital to take risks that other investors, such as banks, bond investors, would not be prepared to take. So it really is the seed of growth to me. It can be very, very long term. I actually find it quite interesting. Historically, ADB has had a view of an investment period of 7 years. That's actually relatively short. That's the investment period of a very aggressive private sector house. I think we can go a little bit longer than that. It's there to absorb loss. It helps companies actually access other forms of capital, in particular debt. It helps create jobs, it helps alleviate poverty, it ensures more taxes are paid, and maybe the most important thing is if we make sure that we're investing in responsible businesses, the actual follow impact on environmental sustainability, on social sustainability, can be absolutely huge, particularly in newer sectors such as education, healthcare, new technology. So we think they're very important. I think the ADB has a role in crowding in as well other equity investors if we can go in as a cornerstone, and we certainly intend to do a lot more equity. I think our target is 20% of new business, probably by deal number rather than volume. Targeting a volume is quite difficult. So it's a very, very powerful tool in our arsenal.
Thank you, Craig. Well said. So Marie, let me come to you next. Now that Craig has well established the need for equity in the Asia-Pacific region, now I have also stated that ADB is primarily a debt organization, both on the sovereign side and on the PSOD side thus far. Can you compare and contrast equity and debt as possible contributors for development effectiveness? And do you think equity, as Craig says, is a valuable tool for mobilization, much more than debt?
Thanks, Nathan. ADB providing funds as a debt provider places ADB quite external to the company, where you may be able to influence, development objectives at the company, but it's more prescriptive and done in a more formal way through the use of covenants and a development plan. The beauty about providing equity makes you more internal to the business. You become an owner of the business, and you're able to influence a lot more on how the company is run, taking into account some of the development principles that you want to introduce at the company that you've invested in. So you can do that through the corporate governance framework at the company, typically through your seat at the board. And this is where it becomes important for any nominee directors that ADB places at the board for them to be cognizant of some of the developmental objectives that we would like to achieve at the corporate, in addition to the regular, strong financial performance and, financial sustainability of the business as we grow it. So, so by being on the board, it allows you to do a more principles-based developmental influence. You're not going to be able to foresee every type of operation the company is going to get into when you're there as a debt provider. Whereas if you're on the board and you're attending monthly board meetings or quarterly board meetings, you get very involved in the growth plans of the company and its expansion strategy. So any proposals that come in to expand operations, they will involve things like expanding employment, where, following on from what Craig said, you create jobs, you put more money in the hands of the people pay more taxes, they spend more in the economy, you may be building a plant, so as a board member you'll be questioning things like the environmental health and safety aspects of the plant, the labour practices of that plant. So there's various things that you can bring in at the board level which you could not do as a debt provider only. Now, secondly, to your point about mobilization, one of the attractive outcomes of having ADB as an equity investor, ADB has a set of standards in its due diligence when it makes investments into companies. So that sends a very positive signal to the market on, validating that company, and, many players in the economy take note when ADB is an investor in a particular company. For example, it gives confidence to the customers of a particular company that ADB invests in. It may also give confidence to the suppliers to that particular company about the company having the financial stability and strength to honour any purchases or long-term contracts it enters into. And it also gives confidence to debt providers. So it further mobilises funding for that company, you know, just due to ADB's involvement. And I mean, some of the areas that ADB adds value in its screening process. I mean, it has very high standards on environmental compliance, regulatory compliance, tax compliance, labour practices. It improves the corporate governance and the board conduct at these companies. It forces them to look at, you know, board reporting, you know, financial management reporting, as well as having done the integrity due diligence on a lot of the shareholders. So that also provides, you know, a gold standard stamp for the investees that ADB enters into.
Thank you, Marie. Well said. So Pierre, let me come to you. Now that you know the role of equity for development, there's been a good amount of discussion that's happened, but we know equity is much more risky than debt. So as a lawyer representing OGC and working with PSOD on a number of equity transactions, from a legalistic point of view, what are the challenges in making sure equity is sustainable from a bank's point of view, while at the same time we are able to add value to the people on the ground in these DMCs?
So I think the challenge is, from an OGC standpoint, is the fact that equity investments are very intensive in terms of resources. And it's very intensive at all the stages of the investment. Mm-hmm. And this is a bit of difference between, one of the main difference between equity and debt financing. And I'm saying at all the stages of the investment, because from the start, as Marie mentioned, when we do an equity investment, we are more or less the owner of the company. So this means that in terms of due diligence, and that's the start of the processing of the transaction, we need to make sure who we are associating ourselves with, i.e. the other owners of the company, but we also need to make sure we know the entity in which we are investing. And this means not only the typical commercial due diligence, but all the legal issues, all the safeguard issues, and issues such as labor issues, because the reputation risk for ADB with respect to an equity investment is much bigger because we are an owner than the reputation risk we are taking when we are doing debt financing. Mm-hmm. So this is at the due diligence stage. Then when we move to the documentation stage, unless debt financing, when you do debt financing, whether it's project finance or it's a loan to a bank, the main documentation is governed by English law. So all your debt financing, the core financing docs will be governed by English law, with a set of very standard provision. For instance, for a facility agreement, you even have a loan and market association loan agreement, which is very standardized. So it's very standard terms of provisions. Now, when you do an equity investment, what one needs to keep in mind is that the main documentation, whether it's the shareholder agreement or the subscription agreement, they are governed by local law. So this means that all the provisions are very bespoke, because the legislation are not the same in India, in China, or in other jurisdictions. So while, for instance, you can have a guaranteed return put option in some jurisdiction, in other jurisdictions, this is not going to fly because of local law. Mm. So you need to have an excellent knowledge of all the jurisdictions in which you might do an equity investment, because this will have a huge impact on the structuring of the main terms of the investment. Mm. So now this is you are at processing stage. Now when you move to the portfolio, and this is what Craig is dealing with, so he knows the issue very well. This is also very intensive, because basically we are never a majority investor. We're always a minority investor. So we need to negotiate minority protection rights. Right. And when you have this type of rights, first, we make an early stage investment, the founder of the company is not really familiar with minority investors. So first you need to basically, it's a constant work making him understand that you're not there to micromanage him running his business, but you're here to create value. Now if you want to create value, you need to exercise your rights efficiently, and this takes time. You have the board meetings, you have the annual meetings of the shareholders where ADB has consent rights. So this means that all the matters have to be reviewed by PSOD, by OGC, by ORM. So this is very intensive in terms of resources. Now, not just the regular portfolio management, but many times ADB invests at an early stage. This means that, and you have several rounds of investment. So this means that after ADB has made an investment and we spend some time working on the processing, then you have additional rounds of investment. This means a renegotiation of all the documents, and then you're back to square one. So this is the portfolio. Then you move to the exit, and while the ideal exit is the IPO in terms of developmental outcome and also financial return, this is rarely the case. So best outcome IPO, second best put option, third best private sale, and then we are back to the fact that it takes time and you need to negotiate with the seller and with the buyer, and with the company. So this is the main challenge for GC, the fact that it's very intensive in terms of resources, and the second challenge is the one I touched upon earlier, is the fact that because these are not standardized terms and they are bespoke terms, it requires a very good knowledge of the different markets in which we operate, and this means additional resources required for ADB if the number of deals is to increase in the coming years.
Yeah. Thank you, Pierre. I think well said. I think a very important point there in terms of understanding these jurisdictions and how the law operates in these jurisdictions is very important. Now, let me come to Edie Beluche. Now, we've heard it from operations. From a board perspective, you see it from the top of the pyramid, and you see all these approvals, and there's going to be hopefully much more of them coming through in the next several years. What are you, broadly speaking, what are your views in terms of use of equity for value addition and for creating development effectiveness in emerging market Asian DMCs? Versus, if you can contrast that to debt, because ADB is deploying a lot of debt for that, yeah.
Okay, you hear me? So thank you, Nathan. First, I'd like to thank Véronique, Nathan, for inviting me to this event. I think you are doing a very great job, ID, to bring this evaluation and the knowledge to us, to staff, to management, and also to external stakeholders. That's really critical. I like the topic. Thank you for this one. So that's equity investments. What I would like to do now is share with you some of the things that we are discussing at the board level, and I hope we can interact and also get some of your views on this. Maybe to start with a bit of background to show you how serious it is taken by the board, the equity investment. So, we have the IED evaluation. So we had a deck a couple of months ago on this evaluation report. In parallel, it was in December last year, we worked with ORM and PSOD in the audit committee on the equity investments. So we tried to look at the financial outcome of all these investments, slicing across direct investment, IPOs, private equity investments, private equity funds, right? And also early stage frontier markets that are part of the direct investments, right? And strategic investments, so CGIF and AIF. I'm not going to talk too much about that now, okay? So we had this work, and now another one that is starting is the capital adequacy framework. So we had a session on this yesterday in the ACB meeting, and you might know that the ratings agencies, they changed the methodology for the MDBs, so S&P first, and the other followed. This will have implication in the capital that we can allocate to equity investments, for sure, probably on the positive side, but there is still work to do on this. And as you know, and as it was recalled by others, the capital equity investments are more capital intensive than debt. So that's the starting point. And then, as you might also know, we have a PSOD strategy that is underway that might be called an action plan. So we started this last year also because as you know, the year was quite challenging for the financial equilibrium of the portfolio, right? So we had probably to make some step back, put things in perspective, and draft a strategy. So that's what we are doing now, and I think that this work contributes a great deal to this exercise. So, well, to your question, it is not the purpose to discuss how equity investments are needed in development. I think it was also addressed by Craig first, and we've already decided in the strategy 2030 that PSOD operations would ramp up, achieving, as you know, 1/3 in 2024. So that's probably a discussion on what is the breakdown between equity and the loans instruments. That comes back to your question. And also you mentioned the merger, so that's right. We have so much headroom. As you know, 2016 the merger almost tripled equity. So that's also the case for the equity investment. If I give a little bit of figures that we had in this presentation, so my figure is 1.3 billion of committed equity, but it was back in December, I think. So the 1.4 that you have is probably more up to date. And now, with the ceiling that we have for the equity investments, we have a $3.5 billion headroom. So financial limit is just not a question at all. We are free to draft a strategy, and we are not bound by this kind of constraints. So this being said, a financial limit and a financial ceiling is not a target. So it doesn't mean that we have to ramp up to 5 billion tomorrow. We need to take time to do that. Difference between equity and loans. So I think it has already been addressed in some ways by Marie first, but these are very different instruments, that's for sure, and you need a different skill set, both on the staff side and probably all the layers to work with this. I used to work with the French AFD, and one subsidiary of AFD is called Proparco, is dealing with the private sector, and within Proparco there was a special vehicle for equity investments. And investment committees in both entities for the loans and equity were separate with different people in these committees. And at the level of approval, representative of the state, but also external board members, people were different as well. So my recollection is that you really need different angles, different skills to, and there is a learning curve with equity investment. So that's probably one first challenge for IDB. So then there's a lot to say about this strategy, but I guess I leave this for the second round.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Beluche. So now let me come back to the audience now, right? Let's make this a little bit lively. Let's take a few questions from the audience, maybe 3-4 questions.
It just happened that 2 days ago we were, I think 2 days ago we were at the Black Sea Development Trade Bank, and we had a discussion on equity, and we had other MDBs also presenting the result of some of their evaluation, including the European Investment Bank. So we discussed some of the issues that were discussed here. And I have 2 questions that were raised there that are still actually a question that I'd like to get feedback from you about. The first one is, of course, the obvious question of additionality. And you very clearly explain, of course, the catalytic role that equity can play, and of course all the benefits also in being able to bring safeguards, environmental issues, all of these actually on the table. I'm more interested in knowing how you evaluate the additionality of the bank in before investing, and how actually you can maybe differentiate between the company that really where ADB investment, equity investment, can really make a difference, and where it's actually just an added partner. So that's one question. My second question is about the role of ADB staff at the board. And Pierre Emmanuel, you mentioned Propaco, and I worked at some point also on the other side from the private sector, but with Propaco, with both entities. And there were very different approaches, the loan and the equity entity. And they also had a policy actually to have, in most instances, to be, I don't know how you say it in English, sleeping partner or something. That means that even though they were part of the equity of the capital, they won't attend to the board meetings. Sleeping partner? Yeah. Observers, well, yeah, as observers. So it was actually not an active role, and I'm very interested in knowing how you select the staff that's going to be part of the board. How can they be really expert in the different jurisdiction, in the different sectors, and what is the role? Is there any, I don't know, framework for them to know where they can go and how not to overstep? You know, I think that's really something tricky. I would really like to hear from you about.
Yeah, thank you, Veronique. There are two questions there. Alex?
In the engagement ID, on this particular report, we know there's a lot of front office interaction from PSOD, a lot of engagement, very constructive, and the messages are taken very seriously. I just wondered how far this report has been read or disseminated within PSOD with the operational staff. How can we work with you to get the key messages, the recommendations out, whether that's a topic discussed? I'd speak of this as full confession as being on the operational side previously in a different organization. I knew my front office took the work of IEG, looking at IFC's work very, very seriously, but as an operational officer, I really felt my time was better spent elsewhere, and I didn't take a lot of time to do it. Is there a way that we can work with you to get staff engagement on this particular equity evaluation? Thank you.
Can we take one more question?
Yeah, actually, I have a follow-up question on safeguard.
Yes.
Several panelists mentioned that is the major added value of, we bring into the corporate on environment, social, labor issue. But on the other hand, there's also a risk.
Yeah.
Because we are minority owner,
yeah.
And then the company might have subsidiary and lot of activity, lot of plans, and then I already heard PSOD colleague, concern about how to control all these risks.
Yeah.
So I want to first question to panelists from PSOD to about your experience on that, and then second to IED. In your ongoing safeguard review, what's your plan for this equity finance?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
From SDSS,
yes.
Safeguard Review Division.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have, let me summarize the questions. The first one was on additionality, right? The role of equity for additionality. The important question there was ex ante. How can we look at additionality from equity, right? Maybe Beluche can take that. And the second question was on board representation, right? And equity is an instrument where a lot of value addition happens after the investment. And so this is a question for Craig, is how do you choose eligible staff for board representation, because these staff need to be experts in that particular area, particular industry, particular segments, particular country. And most of ADB staff are generalists, and we are not organized along sectoral lines. So how do you overcome that challenge? How are you able to establish credibility with these companies in terms of selection of the appropriate senior level staff that can bring network and expertise to these companies? The third question, very interesting question, is from safeguards, right? On how it's true that we are a minority investor, and that there is a challenge in terms of there's value addition because we're going to bring safeguard standards to this company, but at the same time there are risks that we take on, right? So maybe Murray, since you referred to safeguards as one of the key value additions that we bring through equity investments, this is something that you can bring in. And Craig, another question from Alex to you, right, which is how can, there's a new IED report, how much of that has been read by PSOD? How much has it been disseminated within PSOD? Maybe you can tell us something on that. Pierre, I think maybe as an extension of this board question, maybe you can opine on, in ADB, when a staff goes to represent ADB as an investor in the board, there is an apparent conflict of interest because ADB is an investor, while at the same time the staff is representing the company at the board. So how, as an OGC lawyer, how do we overcome this conflict of interest? And sometimes I think in ADB also we are a debt and an equity investor in the same company. So we are really conflicted there, right? Because the interest of debt is very different from equity in the same company. So how do we overcome that? Maybe that's a question that I want to ask you as well. So maybe let's start with Beluche.
Yeah. Thank you, Veronique, for this very good question. I mean, additionality, that's the starting point of what we are doing. There is no questioning about the necessity of engaging with the private sector through lending and also equity investments. The question is, should it be a publicly funded institution, right? That's the question. And the answer is additionality. Easy to say, hard to do, hard to define. The purpose of such institutions is to fill gaps, is to address market failures such as the asymmetry of information, such as a local, commercial, or even international markets that is not functioning. That's what we are doing. So we need to work on the definition of additionality, but then I would say that's not enough. Additionality, it's a binary thing. It's additional, we go. It's not additional, we don't go. But it doesn't give you the sense of how much you should engage. And this is about development impact and ex-ante development impact. That's something I've been talking quite a bit about, and I try to nudge this idea in the board. What we need is an instrument, is a measure, a metrics, if you like, to emulate what in the private banking sector would be the risk-return profile. Okay, the higher the risk, the higher the financial return. But we are a development institution, public institution, so we are not looking for financial outcome for the sake of it, right? So what we need is a risk development return profile. The higher the risk, the higher the development impact, the higher the risk. I'm ready to lose some money. I'm ready to go in frontier markets. I'm ready to go in early stage investments because probably I might lose some of this money, but it's worth the shot. But in the end, don't get me wrong, when a project goes bust, there is no development impact at all. So there is also a correlation between development impact and financial success. And as a bank, you want to remain sustainable, you want to have successful projects, build up capital, and keep going, right?
Yeah. Well said, well said. Thank you, Beluche. Craig?
Your own additionality?
No, I was just going to add something on additionality as well. It's very difficult to determine at any point in time whether you're additional. A lot of the additionality evolves during the project structuring. So that could take 12 months or 18 months. And so sort of from the risk perspective, we'll look at a transaction and see if there are other investors involved that together we mobilize capital to a particular company. But that's just one example. You could have another example, which, as E.D. Beluche says, that it's quite risky and there aren't too many private sector investors, so you may be the only investor in a particular company, and I've got a particular project in mind at the moment, where, I mean, it's a very developmental project, not too many private sector players may be willing to take the risk to go into an investment in that particular company. So in that situation, ADB can still demonstrate its additionality to mobilising funding for that particular company. You don't want the project to be too additional, because if it's too risky, and the private sector's not doing it, then you really have to question, is this a financially viable investment, or are we just doing it because no one else would touch it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Craig?
Am I on nominee directors yet, or still additionality?
You can talk a little bit on additionality before you go to the directors.
It's a broad spectrum. It's a very, very broad spectrum. It's actually quite difficult to define, I think, because if we look at some of our very successful listed transactions, a lot of people might say, well, where was the additionality in that? Now, somebody like me would argue that actually the fact that we took a large chunk of an IPO helped an investor get that issue away, and also demonstrated that capital markets are developing. That is the additionality. So it's a very broad spectrum, and it's not always what you would traditionally think of as a development banker.
Can I just say something on the capital markets? I've been at one of these sessions.
Very short.
Very short, where this question was asked before. Actually, I think if ADB positions itself that it doesn't take a large chunk of the amount that's going out to free float, yes, proportionate, then you are able to see other players in the capital markets step up and take an investment in a particular company. One other thing to bear in mind is when the investment banks build the book, they want a nice mix of different types of investors. They do want an ADB anchor, stable, long-term investor. They do want day traders to create liquidity on the market. They do want a mix of institutional investors to, put the company on the map of, professional institutional investors. So there is room for ADB's additionality in the IPO investments.
Yeah, so we'll come back to additionality now. Maybe if Craig can talk about the how staff gets elected for board representations, and the other question on how
nominee directors. As part of my role, I'm the person that supervises all of the nominee directors that ADB has. I'm going to be very blunt. I do not think it is a good idea to put staff on a company's board. I think actually it's a very bad idea. Now, development banks have had very different models. IFC, I think in particular, keeps on changing. So one minute they go, we want staff to do this. Next minute, go external. So what you will actually see in ADB, and we don't have that many, right? We have about 20 to 30 board seats, I think, right now. And we're actually making a shift to appointing external people, as we usually do it via consultancy. But the skills that you need on a board are very, very different to the jobs we are doing here. And a board member ordinarily needs a lot of experience, right? And what we have to ask ourselves is, what value do we as a shareholder bring beyond the money, right? And to me, that's being a very, very active shareholder with the banker that's monitoring the equity, being very, very hands-on, interacting with the board, with other shareholders, with other stakeholders, talking about the strategic aims of that company, but also putting somebody on the board to help fill a gap almost. What experience are they lacking? What do they need to help them grow as a company? What do they need to take them to the next level? That's never going to come from us putting staff as nominee directors. So that's the shift that we are making. We are formalising process. So we were largely in agreement with the report in PSOD, and we're starting to formalise a lot of the process and framework to actually run an equity business, because it's fundamentally different from running a debt business, and we need to recognise that and action that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Greg. And on the use of the equity report within PSOD, there's a question.
I forgot the very specific, which was, how do we socialise it more? Well, I don't think it's gone to that broad an audience. Everybody is aware of it. There is a management a fairly contained management discussion right now. How do we build that equity functionality? And if I'm being honest, you don't want a very wide debate, quite frankly. You want to have some focused management thought around that. And one of the things we're doing is recruiting a head of equity within PSOD, and then we want to give that person the opportunity to help set the strategy and to build the framework. And then I think we go out there, not so much with the report, more this is what the report has led us to do. This is the new framework. This is how we want to add value, if that makes sense. But I'm more than happy to have an offline discussion about how we sort of socialise and outreach, and maybe it's coming to a team meeting, maybe it's something else. More than happy to talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig. Maybe we go to Pierre now, just to extend on this board representation, and maybe talk about the conflict of staff.
Yeah, so Veronique, I think this is an excellent point that you were making, and this is an issue with respect to which OGC has worked extremely closely and a lot with Craig and Craig's team, and for many, many years. Because I think very early OGC has realized that first you have issues of conflict, and then I will come back to that. But there is also an issue of liability for the person who's appointed. So very early on, OGC had made clear to the people, because as Craig explained, there is a shift now, but in the past, PSOD was appointing most of the directors were staff of PSOD. So very early on, OGC raised the issue that there is a liability at stake. They shouldn't take it lightly, and for two reasons. First, if you want to have some value added, that's one of the key components to have value added at the board level. And second, there is an issue of liability. Because these people, they are basically, the director has fiduciary duties, and he owns his duties to the company. And the main two duty are the duty of care, which means that the person needs to act reasonably and on an informed basis. This means that the person needs to spend some time reviewing the docs, asking the right question, pushing back when he's not happy with the answer. And then there is also the duty of loyalty, which means that the person needs to act in the best interest of the company. And this is the point you are making with respect to the conflict of interest. Now, PSOD and Craig's team and OGC have always made very clear to the directors that they need to act in the best interest of the company, i.e., if there are a decision with respect to which the interest of the company and the interest of ADB are not the same and are inconsistent, the person needs to act just based on the interest of the company. And I think this is easier when the person is not an ADB staff. Now, with respect to, even at the time, and there have been few investments where ADB was both an equity holder as well as a debt provider, and these instances, the person who was sitting on the board was absolutely not involved in the processing of the debt transaction. Because then the conflict of issue is even bigger.
Yeah. Thank you, Pierre. So Marie, maybe you can address this question on safeguards, because it has value in ADB being there to establish the standards. But talk to us about the risks. And
yes. Well, how we manage those risks. So initially, prior to investment, there's the EH&S review and due diligence is done to understand the operations, the existing operations, the processes of how they address their environmental health and safety. So there's the pre-investment work that is done, but then once the investment is made, this is where it gets down to the board member at the company being very aware of EH&S impacts on every aspect of the company's growth and development, and flagging up back to ADB, any issues that may require some additional review on any new projects, as well as the ongoing monitoring that has to happen of EH&S compliance. So it's multi-step. It's not just at the beginning. It's continuous, where this sort of work is constantly reviewed.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. So we've reached the end of time here for this panel discussion, and it's come very quickly. We had a lot more rounds planned. But let me just quickly try to recap some of the key messages that's come out. I'm not going to summarize because this was too rich a discussion, so it's impossible for me to summarize everything. But some of the key messages that have come out. The most important message that's come out is on additionality, right? It's ADB is a development bank. So we're using public money for private purposes, and in this case, for equity. So there needs to be a lot of care in terms of how we deploy that and how we can justify that there are development outcomes that happen as a result of equity. And it is very hard to measure that, put your arms around that, as the panel talked about. So one of the things that we're going to do next year is to do an evaluation on additionality of private sector operations. So some of the other MDBs, like the IFC, has put together a framework now in terms of how to capture additionality. There is financial additionality, like Beluche was talking about, which could be binary, right? You could say yes or no. Am I financially additional or not? And if you're not, as EBRD does, if you're not financially additional, you don't go to the transaction. And then there is a non-financial additionality, which you do after the investment has happened. And there are various aspects of non-financial additionality, and hopefully we are able to bring some measure of clarity through that evaluation in terms of how we can have a framework for additionality. The other big message that came out was that there is a clear need for equity, and that it is seed money, it's growth capital, it's patient capital, is much needed. ADB brings a lot of comfort in the market through its presence. It mobilizes capital. So there is a lot of value that ADB brings through its equity investments. But there is a reputational risk that needs to be well guarded, right? And part of that is through the board representation. And we had a very good discussion on, it looks like going forward ADB is going to select people from the outside for board representation, and thereby have a separation, right, in terms of ADB's operations and the value addition that happens to the companies on the ground. The other point that Edie Beluche mentioned was and was seconded by a number of other panelists, was the differences between equity and the other instruments that ADB deploys. It's very different, as Pierre said, which is very resource intensive. The nature of operation is different, and hence, as in Proparco, one of the things that we had suggested was the committee should be different. The approval process should be different. It should be a lot faster up front, and then it should be a lot more intervention afterwards, rather than in debt where it could be slow up front and then there is no intervention afterwards. So I think the ADB needs to adapt to this, and there has to be, and Craig had mentioned that there's going to be a new equity head that's going to come in, and there's going to be a new business plan. So that's a big message that's come out as well. And another message that I want to highlight is this understanding at the local level how all of these operations come about, right, which is the jurisdiction and the laws at the local level versus the laws, the English or the New York law, which is what ADB operates under. So to understand the differences and to be aware of them, to make sure that that doesn't become a liability for ADB when it's time to exit these equity investments. So I've only brought out some of the certain aspects of the rich discussion that's happened. But I thank the panel here for spending time with us and giving us your expert opinion. And thank you so much.